The history of balloons in warfare is long and complicated. And until researching this, didn't know how crazy it actually was. Filled with a lot of drama on who invented balloons first, drama on balloons being used to devastate cities, and drama of an arms race with balloons being a hidden key player on multiple continents. But in this episode, we are focusing on hot air balloons in war. Mainly when people got in balloons, not just balloons in general, which may be a future episode because, oh my god, has humanity been using balloons in war for many, many years in many different ways. But this is the history of hot air balloons in warfare. Like I said, balloons have been used for a long, long, long time in war to send messages, to help burn cities, to even some biological warfare. But it would be a while in humanity's life until we were able to put people in the sky. The first manned flight would be done by two French brothers, the Montgolfier brothers, Joseph and Jacques. I guess there's a long history of brothers in flying. The brothers did some test runs and developed the first hot air balloon, but they did not put people in it right away. First, an empty hot air balloon, then with some animals, then eventually, on October 15th, 1783, people. By November of the same year, they started to have passengers. And a little over a decade later, in 1794, the French started to implement hot air balloons into their military. In 1794, during the Battle of Fleurus, the French were the first to use manned hot air balloons to help them in battle, using a tethered hot air balloon to act as an observation point overlooking the battlefield. Apparently, it was reported the observer in the balloon could see about 18 miles or 29 kilometers away, which the ability to see if the enemy is coming from miles away and their movement, well, needless to say, vital and important in warfare. Other countries took notice of the possibilities of the hot air balloons in their military. For the most part, all countries realized it was best to have one, and when they did raise one into the sky, have it tethered down and not have them float around and be carried by the wind. Though, a few times that was tried in the early stages of hot air balloon warfare, and it was quickly thrown out the window. Having an expensive piece of equipment literally flying and occasionally landing in enemy territory isn't exactly the best thing, so the hot air balloons remained tethered. For a short time, the French even developed and had a balloon corps, but was disbanded by Napoleon in 1799, even though Napoleon himself even considered using hot air balloons to launch troops across the English Channel for an invasion. He was convinced against it by a hot air balloon expert. Oh yeah, in less than 20 years, an entire field was developed and focused on aerial and hot air balloons. It's amazing how fast humanity moves. While Napoleon disbanded the balloon division, other European countries started to make their own. The use of hot air balloons at this time in war was limited, and that's saying it nicely. It was almost more of a novice. That would be until the Austrians decided to start using them. Now, as time went on and technology advanced in the hot air balloons, so too did it advance in all other aspects of war. A big one being artillery. So when you have the Austrians, artillery, in a hot air balloon, that leads us to the next big bullet point. Pun intended. In 1859, the French went to war with Austria. Only this time, the French didn't have the balloon corps, but the Austrians did. The Austrians would tether their balloon down and have signal flags to direct their cannons on the trajectory of their artillery. The cannons were now able to fire blindly over large distance, and have the observer in the hot air balloon make corrections to the artillery fire. This is, or one of the first times that a forward artillery observer was implemented in war, and it had devastating effect. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, there are also hot air balloons, more of a novelty item, until America started hearing how the Austrians were using them, implementing hot air balloons as observation points. So, America started its own balloon corps. Now, for the most part, the balloon corps was used in map making in America. Map making was, and is, extremely important, hard, and even harder to do in the 1800s. And with America having so much new unexplored land, needing map makers and mapping, having accurate maps, and with America having so much new unexplored land, needing mapping, having map makers and cameras and hot air balloons quickly helped produce some of the most accurate maps for the time. But soon, the American Civil War would break out, and the map-making balloons would be reassigned to help the Union fight the Confederacy. In this, the Aeronautics Division, a Professor Thaddeus S.C. Lowe, would be the chief aeronaut of the Union Army Balloon Corps, assigned by President Abraham Lincoln. Quickly, the Balloon Corps would modify and make the first military balloon, named Eagle, and would first be used at the Battle of Bull Run. Generals and officers loved having the eye in the sky and convinced the Union to make more hot air balloons, 7 in total, which you have to remember, at this time period, mass production isn't a major thing yet, and these balloons are mainly made up of silk and hydrogen gas. Silk being an expensive material, and hydrogen requiring equipment to produce the gas. So having 7 hot air balloons was an expensive, time-consuming thing to do, especially during wartime. But the Union boys wanted them, and we got them. The balloons would be stationed at forts and stay behind friendly lines, tethered down, like over in Europe, to help keep watch of enemy movements, communicate, and even help the blind artillery fire through forest at Confederate camps, which also had pretty devastating effects. The Union even implemented a telegraph up in the hot air balloon, so instead of using flag signals, they could do complex communication to the ground below and to neighboring towns. The Confederates soon realized that they needed a hot air balloon of their own, and fast. So they started to attempt to gather supplies for hot air balloons of their own. For those unfamiliar, the South at this time lacked resources, so the only way they could make hot air balloons was asking for silk donations, mainly targeting women for the donations. The South was able to make 3 balloons, 1 from cotton and 2 from silk. But due to the lack of resources, these balloons sucked and barely worked, and the Confederates had to quickly abandon their hot air balloons. As the American Civil War waged on, someone got the brilliant idea, and I mean it literally, not sarcastically, a good idea to put a hot air balloon on a warship. The first ship is up for debate. I saw contradicting evidence for which was the first ship. It was either the Fanny, a gunboat, or the USS George Washington Parke Custis. Either way, the balloon was used to direct the cannons on the ship to fire with devastating effect, and in turn, making America have the first aircraft carrier. Which is a stretch, I know. A hot air balloon on a Civil War ship is not necessarily what you'd consider an aircraft carrier, but close enough. It's still cool. Soon the Union realized they were going to win the war, and in 1863 disbanded the expensive balloon corps. But to help drive home the importance of the hot air balloon, a Confederate general, General James Longstreet, wrote in a magazine after the war that, and I quote, "The Federals had been using balloons in examining our positions, and we watched with curious eyes their beautiful observations as they floated high up in the air and well out of the range of our guns. We longed for the balloons that poverty denied us." End quote. When a general, after the war, still thinks about a piece of military equipment his enemy had, I think that shows a great deal of importance the hot air balloons had. The rest of the world, having played with hot air balloons in warfare for years now, saw how America used them. and decided to get extremely serious about having them constantly and mimic how they were used in the American Civil War. Hot air balloons became a standard in most countries' arsenals. Used in the war between Brazil and Paraguay, the British using them constantly throughout the late 1800s in multiple countries, even the Second Boer War. Yeah, the British fought a lot of people. I was not going to name all of the countries the British fought in the 1800s with hot air balloons. And because the British fought so many people, they started experimenting and creative with their hot air balloons. The engineers in England wondered what would happen if a hot air balloon and a sea ship had a baby. Well, they went to work to find out, making the nulli secundus, which is Latin that translates to second to none. This was a hot air balloon with a motor to help direct it and fly it. The first time the nulli was flown would be in 1907, and she would never see combat, but it helped propel the arms race that was leading to World War I. Other countries experimenting, improving, modifying all their military equipment, not just hot air balloons, but these other countries seeing a motor on a hot air balloon gave a lot of people a lot of ideas. Enter the Germans, Prussians, and Austrians, who would see England's nulli and approve upon it, making the Zeppelin. Zeppelin, a motorized balloon used for observation and aerial bombing, but don't worry, the Germans still had tethered, non-motorized balloons called, and I'm going to butcher this, but Parseval-Siegfried balloons, which I can't make this up. They kind of look like German sausages. The French, in retaliation for Germany making these balloons, would make the Caquot balloon, which looks kind of like a standard sea blimp that you would envision at festivals. Then World War I would break out, and it was all hands on deck, total warfare. Everything and anything used to win. Hot air balloons became a cornerstone of trench warfare during World War I, for the most part, being attached to steel cables on trucks. These balloons were then sent high into the sky for once again to observe troop movements and direct artillery. But now, artillery was so advanced, the cannons could fire for miles, farther than any time in history before it. So in turn, the balloons had to go higher. For those who don't know, the higher you go in the atmosphere, the colder it gets. It was getting to the point that the hot air balloons were going so high, the observers in the balloons had to start wearing special winter clothing to survive the few hours in the sky. And during World War I, everyone knew and quickly found out how vital hot air balloons were to the battlefield. So, aircraft and artillery started targeting these hot air balloons. In return, to defend hot air balloons, all sides started attaching special units to the hot air balloons. Units of anti-aircraft guns and defensive airplanes. I can't help but imagine a poor guy in heavy winter clothing, alone, high in the sky, getting shot at by artillery and aircrafts, a sitting duck in the sky because you are tethered to the ground, and a balloon filled with hydrogen gas. For those who don't know, hydrogen gas is extremely flammable. Needless to say, those observers in the hot air balloons were poor bastards, but they had balls of steel. You may ask yourself, what happens if one of these balloons gets shot down during this time period? Because, well, with enough bullets, you will eventually hit one. Well, the observer would then have to jump out of the hot air balloon and parachute down in the middle of the firefight in trench warfare and try to land in friendly territory. Not the greatest escape plan, and has happened a few times during World War I. But everyone in the trenches knew how vital those balloons were, from the common foot soldier all the way up to the general. There were even phrases. The balloon's going up. It was a common expression among soldiers in the trenches to signal and say that a fight or artillery bombardment is going to be happening soon. Along with being on the battlefield during World War I, hot air balloons were also set up near oceans and seas to help identify submarines that were looking in local waters. A nearly over 100-year-old technology being used to identify submarines. That's a weird one when I came across it. World War I would end, and each country realized, even in this heavy industrial era, hot air balloons still had a place on the battlefield. So after the First World War, each country started to do even more modifications and experiments with hot air balloons. And when you know it, World War II would roll around and all those modifications would be put to the test. Hot air balloons during World War II would be heavily implemented by the Allied side. Yes, a little bit on the Axis side, but the Allies took heavy advantage of hot air balloons in a large array of configurations. The British forces, in order to stop London bombing runs, started to set up nets in the sky using steel cables and hot air balloons. The purpose was to catch German bombers, fighters, or even the bombs themselves before they could devastate the city below. Surprisingly, this method of giant steel cable nets held up by hot air balloons in the sky was actually pretty effective. Effective enough that the Germans started putting these C-shaped devices on the front edge of some of their aircrafts. So, if one of their planes got snagged by a wire, the wire would go into the C-shaped device, and a small explosive inside it would detonate, destroying the wire, freeing the plane. In turn to these German modifications, the British added more modifications to their nets by adding shock sensor explosives to the net. So if a plane was to run into the cable would blow and detonate from the hot air balloon and release a parachute, causing and dragging the enemy aircraft to the ground. Talk about rapid evolution in warfare. Along with stopping aircraft themselves, balloons were heavily used by the Allied forces to give cover from the enemy aircraft, along with confusing and misdirecting the enemies. A lot of hot air balloons by the Allies were set up in high-valued areas, making it harder for the enemy aircraft to fly low enough to shoot at the targets accurately. One major time it was used, and some may have seen photos of it, was on D-Day. Special units were tasked with making it to the beach, inflating hot air balloons to help give aerial cover from the Germans as Allied forces landed on the beach. Needless to say, easier said than done. Being tasked with storming a beach to set up a hot air balloon? Yeah, I wouldn't want to have that job. As these units took to the beaches on D-Day, many of the balloons would be shot beyond use, but some were able to get to the sky and give aerial cover. By the end of World War II, planes would advance so much that the need for a manned hot air balloon would be over. Soon, helicopters, radar, specialized planes, satellites would all take the position of the hot air balloon. Positions of being a platform for a man observation point to help watch and direct. Though balloons would be, and surprisingly still are, used in espionage and war, the age of manned hot air balloons would pass at the end of World War II, and for some reason, be quickly forgotten. Today, being in a hot air balloon is a novelty, similar to how the French brothers, who all those years ago, first used it. But I think it's important to tell the tale of how something so simple changed the outcome of battles. How some fabric, a basket, and some gas gave mankind the ability to have their side win wars. It is also completely crazy to me how a person would ride a hot air balloon up while being shot at an altitude so cold that they are basically have to wear Arctic clothing, then do a job correcting artillery and relaying troop movements. It just amazes me how crazy, how wild, and I just had to share it with y'all. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and like me are awestruck about how crazy that is. Hot air balloons were used for over a century in warfare. And with that being said, thank you all for listening.